The decade had its stars. The big names, the big labels, the big budgets. But underneath all of that, something else was happening. In small studios, on independent labels, late at night, with just a few musicians and one shot to get it right. Artists were making R&B and soul records that were honest in a way the radio couldn't handle, emotional in a way the charts didn't reward, real in a way that made people uncomfortable. And the industry let them disappear. Here's what most people get wrong about the 1980s. They think the best music from that decade got heard. It didn't. Some of the most powerful soul ever recorded came out during those 10 years and sold almost nothing. Not because it wasn't good enough, because good enough was never the point. The point was profit. And real feeling doesn't always sell on schedule. These are the albums that got left behind. 10 records, 10 stories, 1 decade of soul music that deserves so much more than it got. This is the history they never put in the magazines. And it starts right now. Number 10. Kashif, Send Me Your Love.
The night, alone in my room.
Picture a late Friday night. The good kind. Somebody's apartment. Low lights. The smell of good food still in the air. And this record playing just loud enough to feel.
I get by on the hopes that I'll see you.
That's the exact world this album was built for. Warm, intimate, the kind of music that doesn't need to shout because it's already inside you.
So every day we could make.
Send Me Your Love came out in 1984 on Arista Records. Kashif-born Michael Jones was one of the most gifted multi-instrumentalists and producers working in R&B at that time. He produced, arranged, and performed almost everything on this record himself, which was still a fairly rare thing in 1984. The album was recorded using a sophisticated blend of live instrumentation and early synthesizer technology that gave it a sound that was modern without feeling cold.
But you live so far.
The lyrics move through romantic longing, the desire for genuine connection, the search for love that actually meant something. This wasn't surface level. This was a man writing from somewhere real. The album produced some moderate R&B chart action, but it never broke through to the mainstream pop crossover that Arista was hoping for. Within the R&B community, producers and musicians took notice. Kashif's technical ability was spoken about with real respect in studio circles. But radio programmers outside of the R&B format weren't interested, and without crossover radio, the album stalled. Here's the detail that most people don't know. Kashif had already co-written and produced hits for other artists before this record came out, major songs that other people got famous for while he stayed largely behind the scenes. Send Me Your Love was his clearest statement as a frontman in his own right, and it still didn't get the push it deserved. The album faded because Arista's promotional priorities shifted. The label was managing multiple major artists simultaneously, and resources followed the acts with the biggest commercial momentum. Kashif, despite his extraordinary talent, wasn't given the full machine. And in the record business, talent without the machine is a very hard combination to make work. But musicians knew, producers knew, and the people who found this record in the mid-80s held on to it for decades. This one is for everyone who ever loved someone and couldn't quite find the words. Kashif found them for you. Number 9. The Sylvers Concept. The Sylvers had already been famous. If you were paying attention to R&B and pop in the 1970s, you knew their name, and you knew their sound. They had chart success. They had a following. And then the way it so often goes, the momentum slowed, the trends shifted, and by the time Concept came out in 1961, the world had moved on to the next thing. But the record they made didn't get the memo. Concept was released on Casablanca Records in 1981, with production helmed by Leon Sylvers III, one of the most underappreciated R&B and funk producers of that generation. Leon had a gift for arrangements, for knowing exactly where to put a horn, where to let the bass breathe, where to strip everything back so the vocals could do what they were born to do. Concept showcased that gift fully. The album explored themes of unity, love, and personal transformation, ambitious lyrical territory for a group trying to rebuild their commercial identity. The production was sophisticated without being cold. It had warmth, it had swing. The album barely moved commercially. It came and went without the chart success the previous decade had given the group. Here's the story that matters, though. Inside the music industry, particularly among the session musicians, arrangers, and producers who actually understood what they were hearing, Concept was discussed as evidence that Leon Sylvers III was one of the best in the business. His production work on this album directly influenced a generation of R&B producers who came up in the late 1980s and 1990s. You can hear echoes of Concept in records that sold millions. The source just never got the credit. The album disappeared because Casablanca Records was in significant financial difficulty in the early 1980s. The label that had launched major careers in the disco era was struggling to adapt to a changed market. Promotional budgets were thin, distribution was inconsistent, and Concept got caught in the wreckage of a label that was fighting for survival. That's a cruel fate for a record this good, but the music survived the label, and that's what matters now.
If this song just hit you in that quiet place, don't let this moment be a one-time thing. Subscribe to Demo. We're building a home for real R&B and soul, the kind that heals, the kind that tells the truth. Hit subscribe and come back whenever you need a song that understands you.
Every story you see here takes hours of digging, piecing together history, and bringing forgotten moments back to life. If you'd like to support that work, you can become a channel member. It's just the cost of a cup of coffee, but it helps us keep these stories alive, and for that, we're grateful. Number 8. Deniece Williams Niecy. Deniece Williams had a voice that could make you feel like God was paying attention. I mean that seriously. There was a spiritual quality to her singing that went beyond technique, beyond range, beyond training. It came from somewhere deeper, and on Niecy, she used every bit of that gift.
Oh, I was too blind to see you letting me.
Niecy came out in 1982 on Art Columbia Records. The album was produced with the careful attention to arrangement and texture that characterized the best soul production of the early 1980s.
But now that you've set me free.
Deniece Williams had already proven herself. She'd had real chart success, worked with the great Stevie Wonder as a background vocalist, built a reputation as one of the finest singers in R&B.
It's gonna take a miracle. Yes, it's gonna take.
Niecy was a mature, reflective record. The lyrics dealt with faith, with womanhood, with the complicated interior life of a person trying to stay centered in a world that kept pulling in different directions.
A miracle to make me love someone.
This wasn't a commercial pop record designed for radio. This was an artist speaking directly to an audience that was ready to listen deeply.
'Cause I'm crazy for you.
Within gospel and soul communities, Niecy found appreciative ears. The deeply spiritual tone of the record resonated with listeners who wanted more than surface from their music.
Oh, didn't you know?
The fun fact that colors this whole story is about where Deniece Williams' energy was going during this period. Her faith was becoming increasingly central to her life and her artistic direction, and the tension between making commercially competitive R&B and making music that reflected her spiritual convictions was real.
It wouldn't be so easy, you letting me
Niecy sits right in the middle of that tension. It's an R&B album with the soul of a gospel record.
go. You can be sure that now.
The album faded from mainstream R&B attention because it didn't fit the direction radio was moving. Slicker, more up-tempo, more synthesizer-driven sounds were dominating the charts.
It's gonna take a miracle. Yes, it's gonna take.
Niecy's warmth and depth were genuinely out of step with the commercial moment, and the label focused on the artists who were generating crossover radio attention didn't invest in pushing it through. But that voice, that album, for anyone who has ever needed music that met them exactly where they were, Niecy is waiting for you.
A miracle to make me love someone.
If you're enjoying this so far, go ahead and smash that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of real music history reach the people who need it. Let's keep going. Number 7. Peabo Bryson, Don't Play with Fire. Peabo Bryson is one of those names that R&B fans say with a kind of quiet reverence, a voice like burnished gold, a way with a ballad that made you feel the full weight of every word.
You're looking for a real good time.
And Don't Play with Fire is the album that most people who know his work would point to as his most complete, most honest, most emotionally open statement on record.
I'm like, baby, leaving all your care.
Don't Play with Fire was released in 1982 on Capitol Records. The production was polished and sophisticated, the kind of album where you can hear that the musicians in the room were genuinely inspired by what they were making.
Behind the good life.
The lyrics moved through the complexities of adult love, not the easy version, not the fairy tale. The real version, with its risks and its vulnerabilities and its moments of genuine terror.
Ain't nothing but a state of mind.
Bryson sang about love the way someone sings about something they've actually experienced. There was no performance here, just truth. The album had some R&B chart presence, but it never crossed into the mainstream pop success that should have been natural for an artist of Bryson's caliber.
Calm yourself down, try to take it slow.
Here's the detail that tells the whole story in one sentence. Peabo Bryson spent much of the 1980s being featured on other people's records, duets, collaborations, guest appearances that sold far more than his solo work.
Living your life.
His voice made other artists' records better. His own records, despite being equally good or better, received a fraction of the promotional investment.
Like it was a dream. Don't.
The album faded partly because Capitol Records was going through significant internal changes in the early 1980s, and mid-level R&B artists, regardless of talent, were not always priorities in that environment.
Know what it means. Don't really.
And the music landscape was shifting hard toward the synthesizer-driven sound that defined mid-decade R&B. Don't Play with Fire's more organic, emotionally direct approach felt almost old-fashioned to label executives who were chasing the next trend.
Wanna know.
But for anyone who understands what a great soul vocal performance actually is, this album is essential. The next entry on this list hits different. Stay with me. Number 6. Phyllis Hyman, Living All Alone. I need you to feel the full weight of this one, because Phyllis Hyman is not just a name on a list of overlooked artists. She is one of the most gifted human beings who ever stood in front of a microphone and opened her mouth. And her story, the full story, is one of the most heartbreaking in the history of American music. Living All Alone came out in 1986 on Philadelphia International Records, the legendary label built by Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, the architects of Philadelphia soul. The album was produced with the deep understanding of emotional nuance that defined the best work to come out of that label.
Think of how we plan to get married.
And Phyllis Hyman, 6 feet of absolute presence, a voice that combined the sophistication of classic jazz with the raw feeling of deep soul, gave everything she had to this record.
Saying love how I used to know you well.
The lyrics dealt with loneliness, with longing, with the particular ache of being surrounded by people and still feeling completely alone. These weren't just song themes. Anyone who knew anything about Phyllis Hyman's life understood that she was singing her own truth on every track. The title track became a quiet classic in soul and jazz circles. It circulated on radio stations that programmers of a certain age still remember with deep affection. But it never got the national commercial push that a major label debut deserved. The fun fact, and it's not really fun, it's more a measure of how extraordinary she was, is that musicians who worked with Phyllis Hyman in the studio consistently said the same thing. She didn't need multiple takes. She sang like she'd been carrying these songs inside her for years, and the studio session was just the moment she finally let them out. The album faded from mainstream attention because Philadelphia International was no longer the commercial powerhouse it had been in the 1970s. The soul landscape had changed. The label's reach wasn't what it once was, and Phyllis Hyman, despite her immeasurable talent, was working within a system that didn't have the infrastructure to give her the platform she deserved.
Now I live a single life and I find it so.
She passed away in 1995, and the loss still echoes in the soul music community in a way that tells you everything about what she meant. This album is her gift to you. Please accept it. Number 5. Melba Moore, Never Say Never.
Our love has had its share of trouble.
And here we are. This is the entry I told you about at the very beginning of this video. The one with the story behind the story.
As time's gone by, and I'm sure you know.
The one that goes beyond the music into the kind of industry darkness that most labels prefer stays quiet. Let me first tell you about the album itself, because the music deserves that respect.
I'm able to find another guy.
Never Say Never came out in 1983 on Capitol Records. Melba Moore had already built an extraordinary career, a Tony Award-winning Broadway performer, a legitimate R&B hitmaker, a woman with vocal ability that put her in the very top tier of American singers.
In my mind, I still remember those nights.
This album was produced with real ambition. The sound was contemporary for 1983, polished synthesizers, strong rhythm arrangements, hooks that should have been all over radio. Melba's vocals were extraordinary throughout.
When our hearts were one, won't you?
The lyrics dealt with survival, with resilience, with the determination to keep going when everything around you is falling apart. In retrospect, those themes feel almost prophetic, given what was about to happen to her.
Please listen to what I say. No need to throw away for it.
Now, here's the story I promised you. In interviews over the years, and in accounts documented by music journalists who covered the R&B industry during this period, A picture has emerged of what happened to Melba Moore's career in the early to mid 1980s.
In the end, our hearts will mend. Don't you give up. Never say never.
There are different versions of the details, and I want to be clear that I'm presenting what has been reported and discussed publicly, not making accusations.
Our love's forever. Let's give it one more try.
Some people say the problem started with her personal life becoming entangled with her business affairs in ways that left her financially and professionally vulnerable.
Don't you ever say never. Let's stay.
It's been reported in various accounts that she found herself in contracts and management arrangements that did not serve her interests, which was not an uncommon experience for Black female artists in the music industry of that era, where the power structures were overwhelmingly controlled by others.
Don't let love pass you by.
In interviews from later in her life, Melba Moore spoke with considerable openness about feeling that she had been taken advantage of during this period, that people around her had profited from her work while she received far less than she was owed. There are also accounts suggesting that certain radio programmers and label executives held personal and professional biases against artists who were perceived as difficult, which in the music industry of the 1980s was often a label applied to Black women who advocated for their own rights and fair treatment. The result was that Never Say Never, a genuinely strong, commercially competitive record, did not get the promotional campaign it warranted. It didn't get the radio pushes. It didn't get the tour support. And an artist who should have been having her biggest commercial decade was instead watching her career stall while the machine moved on without her. What makes this story matter beyond the music is what it tells us about how the industry worked.
No way to measure all the pleasure.
Talent was never enough on its own. You needed the machine. And the machine was controlled by people who did not always extend it equally.
Oh, you've been good to me.
Melba Moore eventually rebuilt. She kept performing. She kept recording. And her voice never lost 1 ounce of its power.
And I've given you some time to treasure.
But Never Say Never deserved to be a hit in 1983. It had everything a hit needs except the support. And that's not a musical failure. That's a human failure, an industry failure.
Don't you agree? Explain to me. How could you ever?
That's why this record isn't just music. It's evidence. It's a document of what talent looks like when the system decides not to show up for it. Number 4. Howard Hewett, I'm For Real.
Girl, I wanna sit you down.
Howard Hewitt's voice is the kind of voice that makes you stop whatever you're doing. Clean, powerful, emotionally precise. He could hold a note in a way that felt like time slowing down.
And let you know just how I feel.
And I'm For Real is the album where he showed exactly what he was capable of outside of the group context that had made him famous.
It's been a long time since I felt so strong.
I'm For Real came out in 1988 on Elektra Records. Hewett had been the lead vocalist for Shalimar, one of the defining acts of early 1980s R&B, and this solo debut was his opportunity to step fully into his own identity as an artist.
And much too long since love's been here.
The production was firmly in the contemporary R&B style of the late 1980s, sophisticated, rhythmically tight, built for radio in the best possible sense.
Now I know there's many questions running through your mind.
The lyrics explored love, commitment, and honesty in adult relationships. Not love songs for teenagers. Love songs for people who'd been through enough to understand what real love actually costs.
You're wondering, have you found your love this time?
The album had genuine chart success, it produced R&B hits and showed Hewett had real commercial viability as a solo artist. But it never fully crossed into the pop mainstream, and over time it quietly faded from the conversation.
Have you found the one who cares, who will always be
Here's the fun fact. Howard Hewett has spoken in interviews about the pressure that came with leaving Shalimar, the expectation that he needed to either recreate the group's sound or completely reinvent himself.
right there? I wrote that song just to ease your mind.
"I'm for real" was his answer to that pressure. Neither a recreation nor a reinvention, just a man making the music he genuinely wanted to make. That kind of artistic confidence is rarer than it sounds, especially coming out of a successful group where your identity was always partially shared.
Now your love to me is very serious.
The album faded because the late 1980s R&B market was intensely competitive, and Elektra's promotional investment for Hewett, while real, couldn't match what the biggest acts on the biggest labels were receiving.
I won't play games with you tender.
Solo transitions from group situations are notoriously difficult to navigate commercially, even when the talent is undeniable. But this album stands, and for anyone who only knows Howard Hewett from Shalimar, it will change how you hear him.
And when I look into your eyes and say I love you, girl.
We're halfway through. Which song or album has hit you hardest so far? Drop it in the comments right now. I want to know. Number 3. Angela Bofill, Too Tough.
He's too tough for me. He's running down the street.
There are some singers who live in the space between genres too: jazz for R&B, too R&B for jazz, too sophisticated for pop, too emotional for anything to contain them cleanly.
He's too tough.
Angela Bofill was exactly that kind of singer, and Too Tough is the album where she pushed hardest against every boundary that had been put around her.
I want him in between.
Too Tough came out in 1983 on Arista Records, produced by Narada Michael Walden, one of the most gifted producers working in R&B and pop at that time. A man who understood how to build a track that had both commercial appeal and genuine musical depth. The album was a deliberate shift toward a more contemporary, up-tempo sound for Bofill, who had built her reputation on more jazz-influenced material. The lyrics moved through independence, romantic strength, the assertion of a woman who knew her own worth and wasn't willing to negotiate it downward. In 1983, that message was still not the easiest sell to mainstream radio programmers. The album generated moderate R&B chart activity, but it didn't become the mainstream breakthrough that Arista had hoped for, and the investment in subsequent promotion dropped accordingly. Here's what makes this story so worth telling. Angela Bofill's vocal range, technically speaking, was extraordinary. She could move from deep, warm lower registers to a clear, powerful upper voice with a fluency that trained musicians audibly admired. In a different era, with different industry structures, she would have been a household name in the way that only the very best soul singers become household names. The album faded because the mid-1980s R&B landscape was being increasingly shaped by a very specific aesthetic. The synthesizer-driven, heavily produced sound that dominated radio and Too Tough, despite its contemporary production, had too much musical substance and too much vocal complexity to slot neatly into that template. Radio programmers preferred less challenging fare. But Angela Bofill's fans never forgot, and a generation of R&B vocalists who came up in the late 1980s and 1990s cite her as a fundamental influence. This album is a masterclass in what a real singer can do when given the right room. Number 2. Freddie Jackson, Rock Me Tonight.
Hey girl, long time no see.
Now hold on, because I know what some of you are thinking. Freddie Jackson? Underrated? He had hits. He had a following. He was a name. And yes, you're right. But stay with me. Because the full story of Rock Me Tonight is bigger and more complicated than the surface success suggests.
Do you have a little time to spend?
Rock Me Tonight was released in 1985 on Capitol Records, produced by Paul Lawrence. The album did generate R&B chart success. The title track was a genuine hit within the R&B format.
With me, I wanna know.
Freddie Jackson's voice was mature, sensual, full of the kind of warmth that made you feel like every song was being sung directly to you. The album's themes were adult love and desire, rendered with a class and a sincerity that set it apart from more calculated, trend-chasing records of the same period.
Been going on in your life.
But here's what makes this an underrated classic rather than a recognized one. The pop crossover that should have happened never fully happened. Within the R&B world, Freddie Jackson was celebrated.
Talk to me, baby.
Outside of it, he remained largely invisible to the mainstream pop audience. And in the mid-1980s, that crossover gap was enormous.
Your hair, perfume.
Artists who made it across that line achieved a completely different level of commercial and cultural visibility. Artists who didn't were often treated as secondary figures by the music press, regardless of how good their work actually was.
You wear brings back memories.
The fun fact that stays with me about this record is the response it generated from other artists. R&B singers of that generation consistently cited Freddie Jackson as a vocalist of exceptional quality.
Oh, for you and me.
Among people who understood what a great male soul voice actually required, he was held in the highest regard. The peer respect was enormous. The mainstream visibility was not.
You look so fine. You blow my mind.
The album faded from cultural memory partly because the second half of the 1980s saw an explosion of new male R&B vocalists who dominated media attention.
All over again. Ooh.
And partly because the music press of that era consistently undervalued artists whose primary audience was black women, a demographic that was commercially powerful but rarely reflected in critical coverage. This album deserved to be talked about the same way the biggest soul records of the 1980s are talked about. It still deserves that.
If this song just hit you in that quiet place, don't let this moment be a one-time thing. Subscribe to Demo. We're building a home for real R&B and soul. The kind that heals, the kind that tells the truth. Hit subscribe and come back whenever you need a song that understands you.
Every story you see here takes hours of digging, piecing together history, and bringing forgotten moments back to life. If you'd like to support that work, you can become a channel member. It's just the cost of a cup of coffee, but it helps us keep these stories alive, and for that, we're grateful. Number 1. Anita Baker, The Songstress. I know, I hear you. Anita Baker, underrated? Doesn't she have Grammys? Didn't she become one of the biggest names in soul music? Yes, she did. Eventually. But before all of that, before Rapture changed everything and turned her into an icon, there was this record, and almost nobody heard it. The Songstress was released in 1983 on Beverly Glen Communications, a tiny independent label that had none of the infrastructure, none of the distribution power, none of the promotional budget of a major. This was Anita Baker's first full album as a lead artist, recorded after she left Chapter 8 and found herself essentially starting from zero. The production was relatively modest compared to what she would achieve later, but the talent on display was already fully formed. Every quality that would eventually make her a legend is present on this record. The depth of tone, the emotional intelligence, the way she could take a lyric about love and make you feel like she was excavating something from the center of the human experience. The album found a small but devoted audience, particularly in the Detroit area and among R&B listeners with genuinely sophisticated taste. Word spread slowly, quietly. The way real quality always spreads when the machine isn't behind it. Here's the detail that makes this story almost painful. There were industry people who heard the songstress in 1983 and understood immediately what they were dealing with. Major labels took notice. The question became not whether Anita Baker had what it took, but who was going to get her next. Elektra Records signed her. Rapture came out in 1985. And the rest is the story everyone knows. But here's what gets forgotten. All of that, every Grammy, every sold-out arena, every song that became a permanent part of American soul music culture, it had a beginning. It started on a tiny independent label, with a modest budget, on an album that sold a fraction of what it deserved. The songstress faded from mainstream conversation almost immediately after Rapture arrived, because success has a way of making everything that came before it invisible. The hit record becomes the story. The record that showed what was possible before anyone was paying attention, that gets filed away. But if you've never heard the songstress, if you only know Anita Baker from Rapture and everything that followed, you are missing the moment when one of the greatest voices in the history of American soul music introduced herself to a world that wasn't quite ready to listen yet. She was always this good, from the very beginning. This is where it all started.